Turn to Exodus chapter 2 this morning. We're actually going to go through several chapters here this morning. Exodus chapter 2. How many of you, sometimes on this journey of faith, we encounter God, and here's what I want to get at this morning, just right as we get into it, is we need to experience God. In our Western culture, we try to learn about God. We sit in classes, we come to Sunday school, and we do these lists. George had 3 points this morning to his meditation, right? He said there's 3 things I think we learn. We boil it down in our Western culture, but what God wants is not only for us to do that, and that's a positive thing, but God wants us to see the story unfold. He wants us to experience Him in our lives, and we have to take our Western way of thought, something I've been learning, and how we think as Westerners versus an Eastern way of thinking, and maybe how the Bible was written, which would be better for us to understand the Bible if we were to think about it and see what the story is unfolding instead of trying to have our 3 points and try to, do some deductive reasoning and then sit in a study class and be learners. We need to experience God. And that's what God wants from us. He wants us to experience. He wants us to have a relationship with Him. And it's so hard for us as Christians in the Western culture, the way that we think about things, to really connect in that way because we don't really practice just being a part of the story. God says you need to trust me, and you need to trust the story. Trust my plan. Trust the way that it's going to work. Many times we act as if God tells us what to do, and then He sends us off by ourselves, and He says, well, good luck. This is what you do, good luck. And that's not the way that God works. God works in a way that He wants to go along with us on this journey through the story. We aren't on our own doing the will of God. God is with us. God has some plans for each one of us to do and to work out, but He wants to go along with us in this journey. When God is doing something in or through our lives, He has to get us from where we are to where He already is. He's already working. He's already part of the plan. He's already got things in motion. He's got to get us from where we are to where He is. He's got to bring us kind of up to speed so that we can hear His voice and understand His plan. What He does is He invites us into His plan, and we have to just then be obedient. One thing we need to know this morning is no matter where you're at in the story, you can't stay where you are because God's story is unfolding. It's a continual experience, and it's a continually growing relationship and deeper experience. I want to give you a couple places that you can go to really kind of deepen your relationship this morning. And there is a couple podcasts. Rebecca's listening to the Bible Project, and she's listening to that one, and I'm listening to a podcast called Bema. And so we're doing stuff on our own to grow in our relationship with God and to challenge what we've already been and where we've already been to grow in our learning. So I want to encourage you, if you're not doing anything else, if you're not doing a Bible study, find a podcast like the Bible Project or Bema, and Bema is B-E-M-A. So find one of those 2 that I'm going to recommend to you, and they will help you unfold some different things in this experience that God wants us to have. It'd be a really good thing for you to do. I got on the exercise machine, because it's New Year's resolution, and I put that on, and I was listening to it while I was exercising, right? I was driving in the truck the other day. I had the podcast on because I was going to a store, and so I put it on and I listened to it, and it's helping me, challenging me to grow in this relationship. So what I want you to do is think about the dynamics. The dynamics of a relationship with God is God wants you to bring you to a point of discovery and experience. He wants you to discover and experience who He is. And you have to engage in that relationship. There was a 36-year-old woman who said to the pastor, "Man, Pastor, I have been looking. It's time. I'm 36 years old. I'm 4 years from 40, and I am ready to be married. And the pastor, the understanding pastor, wanted to, give her some wise counsel, and he consoled her by saying, you know what? God's got a perfect plan for you. You can't improve on it. And she said to him, Pastor, I'm not trying to improve on it. I just want to get in on it. I want to know what his plan is. I want to get married. And maybe you feel like that today. You want to get in on what God is doing. And the way that we do that is we have to move from where we are to where God already is, and to encounter God in a new way. There are 7 realities that can lead us to experience Him in a deeper relationship this morning, and that's what I want to get to. And we're going to look at that through the life of Moses. So if you're in Exodus chapter 2, start with verse 23. It says this, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out in their cry for help, because their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Reality 1 is God is at work. See, God was already at work in the life of those people and the lives that are all around. He was already at work in the life of Moses, even though Moses maybe didn't even realize it. Moses took action, and so what his action is I need to stick up for my people, and so I'm going to defend them, and he ends up killing somebody, and then he ends up fleeing for his life, and he's then sent out into the desert, and he's probably not lived out in the desert on his own, and then he encounters these ladies, and he ends up meeting this future father-in-law, and he's in the desert, and God's already at work, but God was at work before that had taken place. But the first thing that God has to do is He has to get us to move from where we are to where He's already at. God's plan was going to be unfolding, and He would come to realize it. Moses' life had to change. There was no more palace. And who knows, maybe he was complaining because he was living out in the desert about his lot in life. I'm sure he thought what he was doing was right when he was sticking up for his brothers for his people group. But he's probably asking, but now what, God? I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. And maybe you're feeling the same way. It's hard for you to see God at all in your life. What we have to hold on to is that God is always moving, and He's always at work drawing people to Himself. We have to trust the story. We have to trust that He's a part of my story as Christians. For centuries, they looked for the Messiah. When's He going to come? When's He going to show up? And for 400 years, if we read the Bible through 400 years, it's as if God just disappears from the story. God doesn't show up. There's no prophet. There's no one speaking for God. There's just 400 years, and it seems like silence. And they're wondering, the Messiah is supposed to show up. Where is He at? But God is still working in the silence until John the Baptist shows up. And the people, I bet, were asking that very same question. Where are you at, God? What are you doing? We're waiting for this Messiah. Life isn't getting any better. And so in our humanness, we think, well, God shows up and my life automatically gets better, and it just gets better the way that I want it. And God has a bigger plan. He wants to get it better the way that He wants it in the end so that we can be saved. Not saved from our situation and every situation we find ourselves in, but saved spiritually for eternity. What God was doing was He was at work. He was orchestrating world events during that 400-year period, raising up obedient people, maneuvering circumstances so that Jesus could come and He could accomplish the work that God wanted accomplished. Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, Paul tells us that when the time had fully come, God sent His Son. When it was time, God sent his Son. God was at work during that whole period. See, God had been at work to set the stage for Moses to get in on his plan. He was making him usable and providing for his survival. See, remember what happened to Moses beforehand. Moses, when he was born, Pharaoh said, okay, enough of these young men, Israelite men, because you know what? They're outnumbering us, and pretty soon they're going to realize that they can take over us, so let's get rid of all the babies. And what God did is God provided for Moses because he wanted to get Moses from where he was being born to where he was going to use him as a leader to lead his people out of Egypt. And so what did he do? He provided a way that his parents would hide him and set him in the Nile River, and he would float down the river, and then God provided a way for him to encounter Pharaoh's daughter, and then Pharaoh's daughter decided to take him in, and then Pharaoh's daughter decided that she needed somebody to nurse him, and then guess what? Moses' mom is the one who gets to nurse him and still gets to raise him. God was there unfolding this whole story, making a way. Look at Exodus chapter 2, 7 through 10. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." Whoa! Here's a slave who's also getting paid to nurse her own son. God's providing in the story. So the woman took the baby and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." God provided. God provided for his education, his understanding how things worked in Egypt, placed in him, in his heart, a passion for his own people when he realized that he wasn't an Israelite or an Egyptian. Provided a father-in-law later on in the desert who would give him wise counsel, placed him in the desert so that when he realized that he was needing to lead these people out in the desert, he already had lived there, so he knew how to survive in the desert, so he'd be familiar with it. See, God is work all around you and me, and sometimes we don't really give him credit for working around us in our circumstances, in the ups and downs of life, that God is working, but he is. You have been called to join him. And I can tell you, if you've been called to join him, you've also been equipped in this world. You've been equipped to do what he wants you to do. Reality number 2, God pursues. Exodus chapter 3, 1 through 6. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire. It did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." And then he says, "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. See, what God did here in this situation is he pursued a relationship with Moses. And what did he use? He used the miracle, not of just a bush that was on fire, because that was normal, but a bush that was not consumed by the fire. It was an ordinary event that was used in an extraordinary way. And you know what? I believe that God still shows up like that today in our lives. We just have to sit back and be able to recognize when God shows up in the ordinary, everyday stuff in an extraordinary way. And we need to get really good at recognizing him when he shows up. That's how he works. He uses ordinary occurrences, situations, people, and for his extraordinary purposes. Notice what it took for Moses to hear God's voice, though. The bush is burning. He could have noticed the bush was burning. He could have noticed that it was on fire over there and it wasn't being consumed. And he could say, oh, there's a nice fire over there. And he could have turned and he could have walked away. But in order for him to hear God's voice, Moses had to turn towards the bush and go towards it. We have to turn towards God when we recognize something that is extraordinary in our life, something that's out of the ordinary. When God shows up, there's going to be a point where we have to recognize it and then we have to go towards him in order to hear his voice. In verse 5, not only does he go towards his voice, but then God reaches out and he says, stop approaching me in the manner in which you are doing. This is holy ground. Take off your... See, we approach God maybe in our own manner and we expect God to meet us where we are. And God says, stop approaching me in the manner that you're approaching me. This is holy ground. You need to recognize who I am and who you are in this relationship. The encounter changed Moses. He said, take off your shoes. I am not like you. I'm different. In that day, servants didn't have shoes. Only masters wore shoes. And there's a big difference there. When we approach God as master, do you think God is going to listen to us and God's going to respond to us? No, we need to take off our shoes and we need to humble ourselves and we need to put ourselves in place so that we can hear from God. In Luke 15, the prodigal son gives us a New Testament account of someone who was lost, who went off and was doing whatever, and when they wanted to come home, and the father would continue to look for him, when the prodigal son finally came home, how he approached his father was, Father, you know what? I am your servant. He humbled himself, in a sense, took off his shoes. Instead of demanding, hey, I'm your son, take me back, I've squandered all your money and everything. No, he approaches his father in a way that his father was able then to lift him up. Say, wait a minute. You're not going to be a slave or a servant in my household. You're my son. Let's put a robe on him. Let's put sandals on his feet. Let's have a feast. See, God is constantly working in our lives through ordinary circumstances, calling us to turn in His direction so we hear His voice and we encounter Him. Reality 3 is that God invites us. God invites Moses to get involved. Exodus 3, 7 through 10. And I just want you to, I don't think we have this up on the screen, but I want you to notice this. In verse 7, God, His initiative, it says this, I have indeed seen. In verse 7, he says, I have heard. In verse 7, I am concerned. In verse 7, I have come down. In verse 8, God's invitation, I am sending you. I've come, and now I'm going to send you because I've heard. I'm concerned. In verse 10, God told Moses, I'm going to do a work, and I want to use you as my instrument. Reality 4 is that God speaks. Why? To reveal Himself and His purpose. Starting with verse 12. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Where God encounters Moses, He says, this is the place that you're going to come back to. He establishes what He wants done. He shows what He wants done. And then when He wants it done, there's purpose. What's going to happen is you're going to go get those people. You're going to bring them back here. And this is the place where you're going to worship me. You're going to go save those people. And you're coming here to worship. God tells us when He speaks to us what His plans are. Reality 5 is we must trust. Throughout this story, we see Moses questioning. It was a crisis of belief because now that Moses was told, hey, this is what I want you to do. You're going to go get those people out of Egypt and you're going to bring them here. You know what Moses said? I can't speak. I can't do this. There's no way. And God said, no, you're going to do this. Yeah, you can't do it unless you do it with me. I'm going to do it with you. You don't have to go alone. But Moses is thinking that he's going to have to go do this alone. It was a crisis of belief. I don't think I can do this. And many of us in the Christian life, you and I, when we're approached by somebody that says, hey, I think you can do this. Why don't you become a Sunday school teacher? Why don't you start talking to your friend at work about your really? I don't think I can do that. It's going to be really weird and awkward at work if I talk to my brother, that person at work, that coworker. It's going to be really weird and it's going to be awkward and I don't know, they might reject me. And you know what? God is at work in your story so that you can tell His story through your life. And we act like we got to do it on our own. That God tells us, hey, you need to go save the world. And God says, no, you don't need to save the world. You just need to go proclaim the good news about me and what I've done for you. And Moses is saying, I can't do this. We got to learn to trust. Moses and God have this exchange, and Moses points out his lack of ability, and God is pointing out his abundant resources and ability. I want you to get this morning. When you believe nothing significant can happen through you, you've said more about your belief in God than you've said about yourself. Let me say that for you again. When you believe nothing significant can happen through you, you've said more about your belief in God than you've said about yourself. Moses had to stop looking at himself, and he needed to start looking to God. And many times you and I are overwhelmed with the task. Now, I want you to think of what Moses had to deal with. 2 million people will say that had to come out of Egypt into the desert. You know how much food that was? I've never really sat back and really thought about all of this part of the story. It would have taken 2 freight trains a mile long, 1,500 tons of food a day. Firewood, 4,000 tons of firewood a day. Water, 11 million gallons each day. That's a freight train that's 1,800 miles long in order just to water the people every day. I wonder if this was on Moses' mind when he was leaving Egypt. I can't do this, God. I've got all these people that I'm going to be responsible for. Moses believed in God, and God took care of these things for Moses. It's should be a neon sign. Look what God did for Moses with 2,000 people, and then what God is asking us to do. And we should be able to trust God. God surely won't have a problem of providing anything that you or I need. Reality 6 is we adjust. Exodus chapter 4, verse 20. So Moses took his wife and sons and put them on a donkey, and he started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. His life had to change, and that's what God wants us to understand. In order for us to get from where we are to where God wants us to be, our life is going to have to change. And what we want as people is we want God to meet us in our life to make our life better the way that we want, instead of really following what God wants. And when we really start to experience God is when we start to turn towards God. We learn to trust Him. When we adjust our lives to meet the Creator of the universe in the story that's already at work all around us and what He is doing. He had to make major adjustments. And experiencing God is not getting God to come to me, but getting me to go where God already is. We seek stress relief from spas and pills and massages. We'll pay people to relieve the stress in our lives, but we will not adjust our lives. A thing that needs to happen is we need to adjust our lives so that we have less and less stress. I've got this problem in my back, and I've got to go to a chiropractor. I've got something pinching there, and it's been pinching there for a long time. And I don't know, I think it's the way that sometimes I sit during the day, and I need to adjust that. One of the things I need to do is need to get in better shape so my muscles are pulled and pulling everything in the right place so that they're holding my spine in the right place, but it pinches something in there and it hurts really bad most of the time. So I've learned to adjust the way that I'm sitting, and it makes it better. But I also need to adjust the way that I'm living my life, and I need to exercise a little bit more so that I get in alignment, my body in alignment. And the same thing for us as Christians, we need to get in alignment with God. It doesn't matter how often I come to church, and if I'm not willing to adjust my life. I need to adjust my life in the ways that God thinks is necessary for me to grow in and experience relationship with Him. I must be willing to change. And finally, this morning, reality number 7 is when we do those things, we experience God. Moses came to know God by experience. He obeyed when it didn't make sense. How can you feed all those people? How am I going to feed all those people? Well, you're not going to do that. I'm going to do that. How am I going to water all those people? You're not going to give those people the water. I'm going to do that. You just need to lead them out of Egypt and trust me and trust the story. And you know what happened in Moses' life? God showed up. God delivered. And he learned to trust. So let me close with this morning. Where are you at in your present experience with God? Where are you at in your present experience with God? Are you not experiencing Him? Is he not showing up? Then maybe you need to adjust your life because He's already working all around you. And ask this question: are you where He wants you to be? Are you where He wants you to be? God